Islam that you write about, that is abolitionist, it's anti-capitalist, it's egalitarian, it's queer feminist, it's a religion for the oppressed and the marginalized. But we also have, and you also acknowledge that is not the dominant narrative of Islam that exists today. We now have, publicly available information that for much of the Cold War, the US and its allies aggressively promoted and encouraged and enabled a very different vision of Islam, something that is capitalist, something that is conservative, something that is pro-authoritarian. And that goes, over decades. So how difficult it is that when we have an already established infrastructure of clergy and institutions that put forward a very different vision of Islam, how difficult is it to unlearn that and fight that and put forward a very different, vision, the anarcha-Islam that you write about?
Jazakallah khair again for that question. So let me start off by saying, and maybe piggybacking off we were talking about earlier, the construction of alternatives, right? And the construction of decolonized education and knowledge, right? We are knowledge keepers ultimately. Every Muslim, and we know this is part of our internal discourse, has a right to ijtihad. And for those who don't know what ijtihad means, it means religious engagement and reinterpretation with text, primarily the Quran. And of course, whether one is a part of the Nation of Islam, whether you're a Sunni, whether you're a Shiite, whether you're an Ismaili, whether you're an Ahmadi, whether you're a Sufi, the 73 different interpretations of Islam, or whatever number that we're at right now, right? The one thing that we share in common is the Quran. We may disagree with regards to the oral tradition and what constituted, and that's a very vast and important corpus that we need to sit down and that I don't take lightly either. But this is why liberation theology or political theology, and I prefer political theology and even more so ijtihad, because liberation theology comes out of the Latin American, if you will, movements insofar as engaging with religious texts, and particularly decolonizing Christianity that way, because Christianity is inherently Eastern tradition. It's not a Western one, as had been usurped underneath Constantine and weaponized as some kind of imperial tool for invasion and for conquest. So the Quran becomes very important in terms of establishing that revolutionary, dare I say, not just anti, but non-authoritarian. And there's a distinction between anti, because if I say I'm anti-authoritarian, that's a rhetorical move, a polemical move. Where are the non-authoritarian concepts that exist within Islam that prove actually that it's non-authoritarian? What are the not only anti-capitalist rhetorical sayings or polemics that exist insofar as Islam, but the non-capitalist concepts? Okay, well, this is part of what I'm doing within the book, and why I use specifically the Quran, right? And again, not that I dismiss the Sunnah, or what is referred to abstractly as the oral tradition, right? And practice, and the prophetic practice, actually. So in Islam, we know the fact that there is no such thing as clergy. We know that there's no such thing as a priesthood, because it's a one-to-one relationship. Why? The principle of governance within Islam, when we go back historically, was aqidat tawheed, that the Prophet sat down to spread for 12 years. It was nothing more. There was no Ramadan, there was no nothing. Muslims were even drinking. They were doing all kinds of things that Muslims supposedly are not allowed to do nowadays, right? But aqidat tawheed, la ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. Why? Because if I engage and I believe in aqidat tawheed, the principle of tawheed, as the creed, that means that I don't worship anybody but creator. So I don't worship a nation. I don't pledge my allegiance to a state, to a tribe, to a bloodline, to a president, to a political party, to a political candidate, to nobody but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't worship money. I don't covet, and so on and so forth. So it's a fundamental principle. Okay. And again, of course, as we said, we have no priesthood, and every Muslim can engage in ijtihad, each according to their ability, and so far as they engage in reasonings, and so on and so forth, insofar as the text, and generally strive that way. So we talked about the anti, the non, I mentioned the Quran. Okay. In Islam, we also know that we're all khulafa. As khulafa, the term means that we're all caretakers, right? Of course, Muslims will constantly use the term, oh, the caliphate, we need to return to the caliphate. But the caliphate is not, number one, again, a binding Islamic concept. It developed way later after the Prophet ﷺ died, right? So it is not a governing principle because, as I said, you can't argue on the one hand that we're all khulafa and then go and do the opposite of that and say, well, we need one leader to rule us all, right? And let me stress this because I discussed this even more. Even if we were to accept that, okay, after the Prophet died, Abu Bakr became the Khalif, and then after that Omar, and then after that Uthman, and then after that Ali, which did happen. But what we're neglecting is several details within that, which is, yes, Abu Bakr may have been termed the Khalif, but number one, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, Ali, let alone the women, the muhaddithat, the wives of the Prophet, Ummahat al-Mu'mineen and Muslimin, Aisha, and so on and so forth. These were acting as a community in unison. What I mean by that is not only did they have different elements of characteristics in terms of personalities. We know that Abu Bakr, for instance, was kind and gentle, right? We know that Uthman was sakhi, he was very generous. We know that Abu Bakr was more strict. We know that Ali was the door to knowledge. They operated vis-a-vis shura, which is an anti-authoritarian or a non-authoritarian concept. We have the chapter of shura, the chapter of mutual consultation, ijma', community consensus, another Islamic concept, which is non-authoritarian. We have maslaha, what is in the ummah's public welfare. So even if in a certain sense Abu Bakr was in the position that he was, or Uthman, their personalities complemented one another and they needed one another, and they conducted themselves via non-authoritarian and in non-authoritarian and anti-authoritarian ways in practice, right? They were not sitting down in palaces surrounded by bodyguards. They did not sit down and establish themselves insofar as at the top of the hierarchy of a certain pyramid, right? So again, we have to realize that there weren't institutions, and even if there were institutions that developed over 1,444 years, right, that there was no such thing as a state, because the concept of an Islamic state simply does not exist. Again, the state is a modern Eurocentric political form of governance, right, that exists. It relies on hierarchies or racial mechanisms, on gendered mechanisms. It relies on a relationship with capitalism and so on and so forth, right? So the problem that we're dealing with, and I didn't get into the non-capitalist concepts and practices that exist in Islam, and we can get to those, least of which is, you know, the forbiddance of riba and interest. That property or mulk does not mean the same thing in Islam than within the Protestant ethic, where it defines capitalism at its core ontologically and epistemologically, because nothing belongs to us ultimately, even our own bodies. If I smoke, then I'm harming my own body. I'm accountable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's a constant politics of responsibility that's involved there. But anyways, so the problem is the fact that Muslims are wantonly, conservative Muslims, liberal Muslims, using terms and are trying to use modern terms and projecting them in ahistorical ways on reading pre-modern societies. Take another concept, right? The concept of imam, which literally means spiritual successor. The same pre-modern Muslims and non-Muslim scholars, right, who argue for the need of a single imam just as much as they argue for the need for a single caliph, argue also that the ummah is independent of the human ruler as imam, and sovereignty lies in the ummah, right? Because sovereignty lies in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the manifestation of the sovereignty is ummah. And what is ummah? Ummah is a non-territorial concept, governance, world that doesn't belong to a particular land, that is for the globe, that includes and combines Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And I need to get back to this whole non-Muslim thing, because a lot of non-Muslims are Muslims in character and a lot of Muslims are non-Muslims in their ethical political commitments. So most scholarship on Muslim governance always affirms that human leaders must be subordinate in one sense or another to the supreme text. So in this case, the Quran is the supreme text, right? Because the word imam literally means the guide, the one that amps, that gives a certain direction, right? So this becomes the problem, that Muslims have lost sight of even terms as imam. They apply and they understand that we're all caliphs, but then they want to establish a single leader as the sole caliph or the sole successor. They dismiss the value of micro anti-authoritarian concepts that we need to all be putting into practice. They're not only just for public and macro political practice, but rather ones that we need to embody in every day. Shura, ijma', maslaha, as I noted, right? They use terms as the Islamic State. Even ISIS referred to itself as a Dawla al-Islamiyya. Well, take this. This is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi that came and did his PhD in Islamic Studies at the University of Baghdad. And yet he, in colonized ways, is using a term that means the exact opposite for state to mean the modern state. So when we look at Dawla, how it's been misinterpreted as state, even Arab nationalists, of course, used it, right? They even refer to as themselves as al-Ummah al-Arabiyya and al-Ummah al-Afriqiyya. We see this racialization of the concept of Ummah that is meant to be a spiritual or strictly spiritual term, right? And it's a distortion of terms as Ummah and Dawla. If we take Dawla, Dawla stems from the verb dal, which morphically as well as semantically falls between the verb dar, which means to rotate, as well as the verb to go away or to fall. The pre-modern meaning of dawla means to rotate. It was associated with temporality, with change, with rotation, as opposed to a fixed order, right? The state means a fixed order, fixed geography, fixed boundaries, as had been defined by white supremacy, by white colonialism, right? Egypt's borders right now are not the same as the borders that existed 200 years ago, 300 years ago. It was once a nation with Sudan, and so on and so forth, right? In fact, Egypt was just Upper Fustat in a certain sense, right? And we can find this because dawla is used in the Quran. So the chapter 59 of the Quran, for instance, the chapter Surah Al-Hashr, in verse 7, for example, speaks of the Prophet's distribution of the spoils of war so that it may not remain in certain hands, so that it may make a circuit or dawlatun amongst the wealthy of you. Right? Analogously, the same thing in chapter of the House of Umran, Surah Al-Umran, verse 140, where Allah talks about the circulation of human vicissitudes and health. One day you have your health, another day you don't have that health. It's a constant rotation. But if you ask any Muslim nowadays, well, what is the word for state? They will say dawla. And this becomes part of the undoing. This is why the Quran becomes so fundamental. So we no longer understand because we've learned to just memorize the Quran verbatim. That's the Wahhabi way. That's the literist way. We forget that there are more blank spaces on the page. We forget that the Quran, again, we become so disconnected from classical Arabic, from Quranic Arabic, even the most well-versed of us, and we're trying to project, again, modern terminologies, modern ways of thinking and concepts that have confused us in relationship to a dehistoricized past, right? So all these different dimensions, right, even within Muslim history, the irony is, like, even when we look at historically speaking, forget about even religiously, there was constantly many dawlas within even a dawla. And we have examples as the Hamdanite, the Bu'ayyid, the Ikhshidi, the Ayyubi, and Mamuli dawlas that existed within the Abbasian period in Ummah. We have Muhammad Ali and Ali Bey Kabir's dawlas within the Uthmanian period in Ummah. Right? The Umayyad Caliphate did not mean, or so-called the Umayyad Ummah in a certain sense, did not mean that there was a seat in Damascus or there was such a thing as Syria, just as much as the Abbasid Caliphate did not mean that there was such a thing as Iraq. Right? So Muslims are weaned on the Ummah, oh, these borders are all contrived. How do we get there? Let us use the state. And the Muslim Brotherhood has bought into this logic, right? And this evolution. So if we talk about it in practical terms, right? Beyond Hassan al-Banna, right, Sayyid Qutb, when we look at Iqbal, we look at Mawdudi, we look at various different manifestations, even in terms of South Asian thought, right? That can we use the state as an instrument towards achieving the Ummah? Right? But they're conflating the state with the dawla as a pre-modern concept. And they don't understand the role of the state and how the state actually functions and what it actually does. Right? So they're trying to achieve a dream without possessing the necessary governance tools in anarchistic ways or visions to understand the application of that dream of how they can do it in horizontal ways. So that becomes part of the problem, right? It's a linguistic one, but it's also a historical material and it's also a political one. Right? This is, as I said, how we get Daesh. This is how we get ISIS. This is how we get the Muslim Brotherhood. This is how we get Erdogan. This is how we get now the Taliban in Afghanistan. This is how we get Wahhabism, right? Because all these different readings are influenced by a white supremacist imprint of modern mechanisms and modern lenses that are projected onto Islam, as opposed to these scholars looking at what Islam has to say for itself from its own principles and then projecting it out into the world. It's like what gender and sexual discourses have to say in terms of homonationalism or from homonational perspectives that Islam is sexist, it is misogynist, it is queerphobic. They're projecting their lenses onto Islam as opposed to looking what Islam has to say for itself about queerness, about gender, about authority, about capitalism and materialism, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a different way of operating. This is why when liberal Muslims say, well, we're going to be secular, or leftist Muslims say, well, we're just going to be Marxist-Leninists, right? The problem of doing that is that you're not dealing with, again, the framework of Islam within itself. And of course, the conservative Muslims, neocons, do the same thing, but they do it in ignorance without relating it to indigenous studies, to Black studies, to understand and to apply Islam in a way that is succinct, right? So they end up doing their whole Daesh thing, right? That say, oh, well, gender has nothing to do in critical race theory, that's absolutely useless, and so on and so forth. And what does indigenous studies or Black studies have to contribute towards? And so the problem lies from both sides. And so in my work, this is why it's inherently disciplinary. I was not only using Islamic studies and Quranic studies, but the various different fields of studies, because I was arguing for non-provincialized understandings of indigenous people, because indigenous people are not just something that exists within Australia or New Zealand or the global north or the US and Canada, right? And so I was arguing for non-racial, non-ethnic understandings of indigeneity that coincide with what in Islam I refer to, or what is referred to as the fitra. Because indigeneity is the inherent nascency that we as Muslims, unlike the original sin in Christianity, are driven to do good, to connect with community, to embrace our emotions as feminine practices, to embrace community, to engage with the land, to feel its spirit and oneness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and creation as extension of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to not be selfish, to not be materialist, to not be authoritarian, and so on, until we are weaned in the environments that we're weaned on, such that we become all these evil things, right? So this becomes an aspect. Blackness and the necessity for deprovincializing Blackness, because hell, if you care about Black people in the US and Canada and so on and so forth, and anti-Blackness and dealing and contending with anti-Blackness and abolition and the Sandra Bland litany of just death, as much as, of course, there's Black livingness of Sandra Bland, of George Floyd, of Trayvon Martin, and so on and so forth, that are still very much continuing to this day, right? Then you need to understand, well, Africa needs to be important, because Africa is the size of, well, East and West Europe, China, let alone Japan, and the UK. So that's how big Africa is. So where are we in retrospective of the US and Canada, and again, its size in comparison to Africa, right? And AFRICOM and all that, and that particular trajectory. So this is where you need to understand gender studies, you need to understand queer studies, you need to understand critical race studies to be able to connect to that 1492 arc, again, from historical, material, symbolic, spiritual perspectives, to understand what had happened globally. So that is how you counter conservative and liberal manifestations of Islam, or neoliberal manifestations of Islam, arguments that, oh, well, Islam is inherently capitalist. Well, how can you argue that? Did you look at inheritance laws in Islam that are meant to combat hoarding within a particular and minimize despotism and so on and so forth? Did you look at the concept of riba and it's forbidden in terms of interest? Where would capitalism be without riba? What would shift in terms of paradigm when you look at property not meaning the same way in Islam that it does in capitalism? How does that shift our lenses? Islamic banking, and again, the limitations of even what that term means in the contemporary, because it has fomented an island of halal, or an island that is halal and an ocean of haram. So it's very limited in terms of what did even the term Muslim mean in comparison to non-Muslim? Because then this becomes an important point, that Allah in the Quran uses various, Allah is supreme. And we have verses, as you know, in the Quran, like the second chapter, that begins with Alif Lam Mim, 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of. This is to even humble Arabs so far as their own language, right? Not a lot of Muslims recognize that, or even non-Muslims realize that. But even if we look at the concept of non-Muslim, because I was asked regarding this by an indigenous elder, when we had a prophet that was referred to as Narabajo, do you think that he was a prophet. In Islam, you have hundreds of thousands, if not oral narrations that label that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent 300,000 different prophets to different tribes and nations, and as the verse goes, so that we may get to know one another. And the best amongst us is those that exercise a kind of taqwa, a kind of piety in relationship to adala, in relationship to social justice. Okay. Well, Allah in the Quran uses the term, again, we have to pay attention to lughat al-khitab, or the language of narration. Sometimes in some verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal muslimeen wal muslimat, Allah speaking directly to Muslims. But in many verses in the Quran, Allah is saying, Ya ayyuhal mu'mineen wal mu'minat, O believers. This is not just Muslims, but Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, Sabians, and so on and so forth. Mu'mineen, those who believe in a single creator. And then what defines the character of the mu'min? Because what distinguishes between a disbeliever, a kafir, that the West likes to throw about, and that even takfiri Muslims like to throw out. I mean, can you imagine that we have gone into a point where ISIS considers Al-Qaeda to be kuffar? I mean, that's how insane that we have gotten, right? It's not just a Sunni Shia, I think it's now Sunni squabbling amongst one another. But if you look at what is described as a kafir or an idolater, as a mushrik, as a disbeliever or an idolater, are those who dabble in excess, uphold injustice, spread mischief, corrupt in the earth. We could look at verses 251 to 251, sorry, in Surah Al-Baqarah, 756, 774, 873, and endless, right? Why? Because Islam distinguishes between religion, deen, faith, iman, and ruhaniya, spirituality. These are three interrelated concepts, but they're not one and the same thing. So a lot of mu'mineen are Muslims in character. They don't need to adopt the name Muslim because these are all different paths to the same creator. This is why our identity politics also becomes very limited, and why I said you telling me you're a Muslim means absolutely nothing to me. You could be a Zionist Muslim, you could be queerphobic. So are you abiding? You could be a Muslim that's capitalist. Does that really make you then a Muslim when you're not upholding social justice? So we've left the trunk of the tree and we're hung up on the branches. Does this sister wear the hijab or not? Does this Muslim pray 5 times a day or not? And not to take away again from the significance of the hijab or the significance of praying. Not at all. Look, we waste more during Ramadan than any other time of the year. And what is Ramadan designed to do? So for us, it's a form of mutual aid relationship, and a relationship of reciprocity and kinship with the poor. This is supposed to continue on. What is the idea of zakat? It's not some kind of alms tax that's benevolently given. Now we give it to institutions. No, it's supposed to be given face to face, because you're supposed to look into the eyes of the poor person that you're giving it to. You're supposed to hold out your hands, because it is the right of the poor over the wealthy or those who have more. You're supposed to look them in the eye to establish that kinship relationship. But when you give it to an institution where you're no longer responsible, when you're giving it whatever is allocated in terms of percentage right now, how is that supposed to be enough when we're talking about a capitalist order? What's that percentage supposed to do in relationship to a whole stream by which you have received your money in non-halal ways, and you consider it to be some act of charity? So it demands of solidarity, it's the means of community, it demands of responsibility that we have towards one another. So this becomes, unfortunately, the mechanism and the way that modernity has enforced upon us, and the crisis of identity, if you will, that we as Muslims are suffering from, because we are suffering from a crisis of identity. We have either adopted Orientalism or neoconservatism and fundamentalism as reactionary impulses to the crisis of modernity. And that's because we don't understand truly what modernity has brought of values, of governance orders, of mercantile orders, of exploitative orders, of racial orders, of sexophobic orders, and this becomes a problem. So how can you apply Islam to a world that you don't understand? This is the problem with most Muslim scholars. You can't. You have to be able to see the forest and the trees. And so, yeah, you're reaching out for the branches and you're missing the trunk of the tree. You can't. To the trunk of the tree is what organizes life. Capitalism and the nation state. They're what organizes everything else, including gender, race, sexuality. So you need to contend with that. And until you do, you won't be able to provide any liberatory form or vision of the ummah.
So we've talked about one end of the spectrum.